Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. This is our third program, I think. So today, my name is Jeff Edwards. I'm with UW Extension, and we also have Jeremiah Vardaman up in the Powell area. He is also with UW Extension. And our guest today is Donna Hoffman. She is a horticulturist with UW Extension in Casper, Wyoming. And today, I think that we are going to be talking about germinating seeds indoors. Is that what we're planning on talking about, Donna?
That's the plan. It is kind of right at the time where everybody should be thinking about doing that if you're going to do that. And we should be right about the right time for people to get started in those things and have things successful just about the time that our last frost-free days appear.
Which vary quite a bit around the state. The last frost-free day. Donna and I were chatting earlier. Jeremiah, what's your average frost-free date up in the Powell area?
So down here in the town of Powell, we're about 110 days is our growing season.
But your last frost-free day, like May 10th, May 15th-ish?
May 20th.
May 20th.
So
okay.
May 20th through June 5th is when dry beans go in, and that's usually they're trying to hit the last frost. They don't want any frost on those dry beans coming up. Sorry. Yep.
Right. Yeah. And so Donna, your last frost-free day.
We usually say around May 22nd. I have seen as late as May 25th for the average. So usually the end of May, usually it's safe by Memorial Day weekend. Here in Casper, we also have a few people who say it's safe to plant out if all the snow on the face of Casper Mountain is gone.
Local lore, right?
Yeah.
As long as there's not a late snowstorm in May.
could be July if things happen to work out. In Goshen County, we usually say May 15th is about the last frost-free day. So we've got wide variety around the state, and if we're 7 weeks out approximately.
Yeah.
So it would be a good time to start thinking about getting things planted and trying to get them to germinate inside. So Donna, how do we go about doing that?
Well, hold on before we do that.
Oh, okay.
No, just wanted to mention again to our participants, if you have questions, hit us in the question and answer chat box there. Jenny, our host, is monitoring that, so she'll bring those questions to us. So interact with us if you got specific questions.
We love questions.
So,
sorry, now go ahead, Donna.
Okay. Well, I thought this would be very conversational, and we'd kind of keep it informal. We'll see how the conversation goes and where the conversation leads. So I thought we'd just talk about, to start with, deciding what it is that you want to plant. There are lots of things that we want to consume from the garden, and then every family has some things that they don't want to consume from the garden. My husband wants to put in turnips, and I have no interest in eating turnips. I'm a little more willing to eat Brussels sprouts, but he's not a big fan of them. So there's no point in us putting in an 8-foot row of some of those veggies, but we might put in a couple feet of them so that we have a few of them to enjoy right after the harvest later in the season. Neither of those really have to be planted indoors. The Brussels sprouts can be planted indoors, but turnips are one of those plants, because it's a root crop, that you'd plant directly outdoors. So there are a few things that you can grow in the garden that you don't need to think about planting ahead of time. And then there are things that you can succeed with by putting them in pots and getting them started indoors. And because we have a short growing season, Jeremiah mentioned that we have about 110-day growing season. Casper's is about 110 days on a good year. Most people figure that we have about 90 days here, 95 days on an average year. And I know down in Laramie, the growing season there is about 70 days. So if you want to extend the length of that growing season, one of the ways to do that is to get stuff started inside in containers, so that when it's a little bit more mature and the danger of frost is gone, you can take them from inside to the outside and get them started that way. One of the things we'll want to mention at the end and talk a little bit about is hardening them off before they go outdoors. But the first thing is to decide what it is that you want to put in containers. And I have a slide here.
So just a question real quick. So we can grow almost anything indoors, correct? So it doesn't always have to be what we want outside later. Is that correct?
That is true. You can grow much of your garden plants just indoors, especially for those who live in an apartment building. If you want to grow things indoors and they never end up outdoors, as long as you've got plenty of light indoors, you can grow pretty much anything inside.
And maybe plenty of space, right?
Yeah. You can't get overwhelmed with garden space indoors, but maybe your apartment has a balcony where you can share a little bit of it with inside and outside to expand your space. But if you have no space outdoors, you can grow things indoors throughout the season as long as you've got enough light to do so.
And so I guess I was thinking you could even maybe begin the harvest earlier, right? With those cool season plants or maybe those fast growing plants like lettuce or something like that. I could grow indoors and be harvesting those a little bit even before they get outside.
Sure, there are some of those things that can be harvested indoors. Things like tomatoes. I have had a couple of people over the years come to the extension office and talk to me that they've actually had tomatoes that have lasted a couple of years, and they've kept the same plant growing indoors near a south window or a sliding glass door, and they've been able to harvest off of them more than one season. So you can take some of the hot season or hot heat loving plants and grow them indoors and have success for a very extended season, dependent upon what it is that you enjoy growing. And of course, there's lots of people that grow sprouts on a continuous basis. I think some of
multiple years on tomatoes is a good idea until you get whiteflies.
But yes, yeah, that would be no fun in your house.
I was just going to say that's a lot of commitment.
So the entomologist has to bring up the doom and gloom of the possibility of growing things extended term.
Well,
there's always something.
Part of gardening is every once in a while you have to have a reality check, and you do have to think ahead about what could go wrong. Jenny?
We already have a question from Kyla, and so please forgive me, anyone, if I mispronounce your name. She asks, if you start squash or melons too early, can you grow them inside and set fruit on them indoors before your last frost date? Do you have to hand pollinate?
Squash are a plant that has male flowers that come on first and then female flowers that come on later. So I would say that you would get more harvest if you did hand pollinate. You can take the male flowers off and actually carry them over to the female flower and pollinate that way. You can also use an inexpensive paintbrush from your kid's watercolor kit to transfer the pollen to the stigma of the female flower and pollinate that way. I have never heard of anybody growing anything in the cucurbit family indoors and having successful harvest from hand pollinating indoors. And in fact, the cucurbit family is one that I usually recommend people plant directly outdoors. They don't transplant so well, as far as I know. Jeff?
So if you do choose to grow these types of plants indoors, you might want to look for bush type varieties instead of vining type varieties, unless you have a really large home, because they will take over.
I have had this idea that we did a beginning gardening class several years ago for people that were inexperienced gardeners. And we all know that we go to the nursery and we buy a little plant in a 2-inch or maybe a 4-inch pot, and we carry that plant home, and cucurbits end up with leaves that are like this big. So the plant that they grow on can be quite long, and the branching, the vines on a cucurbit can be several feet long. So that plant could easily take over, and you could have the snow white vine covering the castle, or a trellis
The
for
bedroom.
Rapunzel to climb down from. Anyway, I've wanted to do something with a cutout of brown paper to unfurl the plant to show the size that you get with a cucurbit. If you start with a little 2-inch pot, and all of a sudden, the end of summer, you've got a plant that could take over a room.
So Donna, you might want to mention what's in the cucurbit family.
Yeah.
So
what other plants? Yeah.
Cucumbers and squash are the most common ones. Melons also fall into that category. Guys, are there others you think of?
Those are the main ones I think of.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my thought is, if you did start them indoors and you weren't able to get them planted outside, if you have a patio or a porch or something that you could slide them out on during the main part of the season, you wouldn't have to worry about pollinating them yourselves. You could allow the bees and flies and those types of things who normally pollinate them to still visit them and take the work away from you.
Yeah, you may find yourself more successful at putting them in a little bit larger plant container, a pot, and then eventually getting them transplanted outdoors. They're one that I'm not sure that I would want to supply the water and nutrients to in a container all summer long, unless you really just don't have space for it. And as Jeff mentioned, you want to purchase one of the bush type that's a much more condensed plant.
Automatic watering system.
Yes, yeah.
So we have another question that's come in across Facebook, and it's from John Metcalf, and I think you might want to answer it a little later because I think you're going to cover this subject. He says, thanks for doing this. What can I do to keep my indoor plants from getting leggy?
Well, the light fixture will help with that. One of the things that will really help is starting the plants just in time to put them outdoors for the last frost-free day. And once you get closer to that last frost-free day, the weathermen, as much as we get frustrated with them and think that they're only right half the time, they do a pretty good job of helping us know when we're expecting the last frost, the last snow. And if you get to that point and you do plant things outdoors, they're a way to protect plants from a frost that occurs after that traditional frost-free day. You know, Mother Nature does throw hooks at us every once in a while, and they come in the way of unexpected snowstorms later than we anticipated. So there are ways to get around that as well, but lighting is the most crucial part. My Master Gardener group grows things for their plant sale on an annual basis in the greenhouse we have here at the Extension office. But the windows have a glazing on them that was supposed to protect the greenhouse from getting too hot. In the process, it cuts down on some of the light. And so if they plant things too early, the plants will stretch to reach for the light. And that's just their normal growth pattern. If there's not enough light, they just stretch to reach for it. And they do get leggy. With things like tomatoes, you can plant them deeper when you do get them outdoors and they have plenty of sunlight. But if they get leggy, it's because you planted them probably a little too early and there wasn't enough light coming from the light fixture that you have.
So Donna, it could also be an issue with not the right wavelength of light that they're getting.
Yes.
So there are, and we may cover this a little bit later on, but there are grow lights that are specific to germinating and growing plants to keep them from doing that type of thing.
So when someone says leggy, though, like as a beginner gardener or a novice gardener such as myself, leggy just means that plant is spindly, stretching out. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's got longer than it normally would have had it had adequate light.
And it's a light deficiency kind of symptom, right?
In most instances it is. It can be a nutrient deficiency or something along those lines. Could be that the plants are crowded together, too close together, but that creates a low light situation. So yes.
Okay. So all right, Donna, let's get back to kind of where we were at. We've made our selection, right, of what we want to grow. Jeremiah is not going to grow broccoli. We understand that. So now what is the next step that I need to look at to do these
So
indoors?
you probably either need to be shopping for those plants over the winter months, ordering them in, checking with your local garden centers. I did just read that the local garden centers are staying open because of the connection to the food supply source even this year. So you should be able to find seeds or order them online at this point in time. And then once you have your seeds, you want to be good about reading the label and finding out how far in advance your seeds need to go in the ground, and how many weeks before frost you need to be planting them. And I have a tip that I want to, and maybe I don't know, Jenny, I may need your help. I'm going to do the stop the share here for a moment.
What would you like?
So Master Gardeners here in Natrona County purchased these a few years ago, and I'm sure that's blurry, but it's a little slider that you can adjust based on when your last frost-free day is. So I'll put it back up. This is for Casper. Our last frost-free day is about May 22nd. And you can see that you can count back how many weeks before planting to start everything. And it tells you, like for, let's see, starting indoors, cabbage would be right along the lines of the broccoli. So if I have my calendar set right on May 22nd as the first frost-free day, the first date to start things indoors was about mid-March. But because we're somewhat unsure of when that frost-free day is going to occur, sometimes the spring just feels like it's going to be colder, and we don't have a light at home. I have just recently started seeds indoors over the last weekend, and that they'll be a little bit smaller than they would have been if we'd have started them 2 weeks earlier, but I minimize the chance of it being too long indoors before the weather changes to warm outdoors. And so we're going to have planting time for most of our garden plants from now until that last frost-free day. I may have a little bit smaller plants come time to put them outdoors, but they will settle into their site pretty well in that smaller size and continue on their growth through the growing season. So knowing when you want to plant your seeds and kind of creating a schedule for yourself. I've written down a list of what we want to plant and then the days that we want to plant it. We're also going to plant one set of things this week or whatever week that we start them, and another set either a week or 2 weeks later, so that you have a rotation of plants that will continue to give you a longer harvest through the gardening season when we get them out in the garden and then they settle in, and then we begin to harvest off of those plants.
Donna, so, is that tool available? Do you have it available for others?
Yes, they are for a small purchase price of $5. Okay. The Master Gardeners here in Natrona County purchased those, and they do have them available for purchase. We can mail them out if anybody's interested in getting one right now. It does come with a chart that lists frost-free days. There are 3 communities in Wyoming listed, but they are pertinent for other places across the state. And that's one of the things that I thought was a great thing about that tool is you could buy one here and give it to your best friend back in Pennsylvania, and it works for them too. Just need to know when their frost-free day is to use it.
And on the Barnyards and Backyards website, there is a link for frost-free day.
Oh, great.
The first frost-free day that has been compiled for most of the towns in Wyoming.
Great.
It's on the Barnyards Backyards website. So they just need to get in touch with you, either through email or phone call, to try and get one of those.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
So the Natrona County Extension Office is a great number to call us.
Okay. The other question I had, you were talking about it. What is one of the concerns that we would have of having the plants indoors too long?
Is that they would not get enough light, or that they could outgrow their container, the root system would get large, and they'd need to be transplanted before it's time to get them outdoors.
So if they did go too long, you could still maintain them, and that just means more work, more effort, chance of getting leggy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Nobody likes leggy plants.
No, right. They're much stronger if they're more condensed when you plant them outdoors. And one of the tips that I've used for gardening since I was a kid is that if it's blooming when you put it outdoors, usually you want to pick the blossoms off of it so that it puts its energy into developing roots when it gets started outdoors. And so we don't want to have them so mature that they're ready to start reproducing right away when it's transplant time. We'd rather the plant still be in the process of putting in good root system and growing leaves when we transplant it outside.
Right.
So the other thing, Jeremiah, is if you're not really watching it and it has a pot that might be too small for the plant, if the plant continues to grow, it will get root bound. So the roots will basically form in the shape of the pot.
In a circle.
Yeah, wrap around in the pot. So that's one of the things that you have to watch out if you go to transplant it. It's just going to stay in that
condensed ball.
They won't grow out normally like they should.
Yeah, and occasionally they just get stunted and they stop growing and developing like you would if you start them too early. We have a question from Sandra. She says, have you had experience in starting tomatoes in a hydroponic system so they get larger and then transplanting them into a pot or the ground?
No.
Great question.
That is
No.
a good question.
Yeah.
That would be no for me too.
I have not started tomatoes in a hydroponic. I've grown transplants in a hydroponic, but that's my only experience.
Okay.
So Jeremiah, I have no experience growing in hydroponic. When you worked in the system that was growing in hydroponic, did you start with plants that had been grown in soil and you washed the soil off and started them that way?
Correct. Yeah, so we either bought bare root stock or we started in soil and then washed the roots off and then put it into hydroponic. I have not heard of starting seeds in a hydroponic, but it could happen and it could be out there. I'm just not my experience and not my knowledge.
Yeah, everything I've seen has some sort of a fibrous structure substrate that they grow in to develop their root system. So I'm not aware of a system that has nothing for them to grow in but the liquid from hydroponics.
Give it a try. Let us know.
Yeah.
Is that the only question we had, Jenny?
We had one more. It's on ranunculus. It's from P. Miller. It says, literature says it can be grown in zone 3. I am thinking I will start from corms in a container inside. I may leave some in the container outside and plant some in the ground. When should I start them? Any suggestions?
I believe ranunculus are one of the fall planted bulbs. So usually they would be planted in the fall, and most of the fall planted bulbs require a chill in order for them to set bloom. So they'd have to be outdoors during a certain number of the winter hours to get that cool. You can refrigerate bulbs in your refrigerator. Usually we don't recommend putting them in the refrigerator with your fruits and vegetables because the hormone exchange between ripened fruit can affect blooming plants like the tubers and corms and bulbs for fall planted. But you can then plant them in containers, and when they're indoors, the heat will encourage that blossom to come on. So sometimes those spring bulbs are forced to bloom by encouraging them to bloom indoors rather than keeping them outdoors in the cool where they would bloom on nature's schedule.
Great.
Okay.
So we have our seeds. We've picked back the date, right, of when we should start those. And they're going to be different for individual species, correct? It's not all going to be uniform.
Right, which gives you an opportunity to continue your gardening week after week leading up to that first frost-free day, and then watching the weather when the weatherman says it's time to go ahead and get things outdoors.
And fighting off leggy plants, right? Okay. And so then for you specifically, Donna, you then stagger the same species like 2 weeks out. So as you start planting your garden, you have produce coming on through the harvest season in intervals, so you always have something ripening and basically feeding your harvest, correct?
Exactly. So we stagger the planting so that we can stagger the harvest, and not all of the kale is ready to harvest the same week, because you know how it is when you want to eat kale, but you don't want to eat that much kale.
Yes.
So having it a little bit available for several weeks will extend your harvest time when it's time for that particular crop to be ready to eat. It looks like we have somebody that has their hand raised.
Jeremiah, you need to start planting your 1 seed of broccoli now, and then 1 seed of broccoli next week, and then continue on throughout the season.
Okay, I can do that.
Donna Fox, did you have a question?
She is muted.
Yeah, it's not allowed.
That might be. We might have
to have her type it in the chat.
Yeah, if you could type it in the question and answer box, that would be great.
I didn't know how to do
Oh, there she is.
Oh, there she is.
We can hear you.
What I want to know about is grasshoppers.
What do you want to know about grasshoppers?
All right, I was very nonplussed. Well, I was reading all of your things about your backyard barnyard and all that. Last year, my garden was practically wiped out with grasshoppers. It was awful. There was hardly any point in having planted the thing, except for the tomatoes. They didn't eat the tomatoes too badly, but I hardly had any green beans or anything else. They ate it all.
Sure.
And then someplace in your literature that I was reading yesterday, there was a phrase that said, it looks like this might be a bad grasshopper season.
Yeah, that was in our magazine. Mm-hmm.
All right. How sure are you of that? When how diligent should I be about planting anything?
So Donna, grasshoppers' life cycle is very cyclical, and if you had them last year, it's highly likely that you will have them again this year. Most of the populations in Wyoming are currently in a building phase, and I anticipate the next 2 or 3 or 5 years to be pretty significant grasshopper issues. I have to ask you this: how aggressive do you want to be in order to try to manage them?
Well, I live on the edge of town, surrounded by a lovely meadow.
Oh, perfect.
So what are the options, Jeff? So she'll know.
Yeah,
nobody sprays anything, and consequently, if I don't have turkeys that come roaring through to eat my grasshoppers, I was absolutely, they were just terrible.
Yeah, so there are options if you start early, though. And the problem is, if you're surrounded by a meadow and if there is no control happening there, you will just be reinfested over the course of the summer.
It's going to be an ongoing battle.
It'll be an ongoing battle. Yep. So if I can offer a few things, when you first notice them, the grasshoppers are best controlled in the second instar, and that's about the size of a grain of rice. So when you're walking around the outside of your garden and you see these little things hopping around, that's the easiest time to control them chemically. I can't think of the generic name of 7 right now.
Carbaryl.
Carbaryl. Yeah, thank you. Carbaryl applied at that time will take care of a lot of them, but if you if nobody takes care of them in the meadow, they will just keep coming. There are some other bait products that are available that have carbaryl in them. It's a brand-based bait. And then there's another product that is a Nova bait, or it is a bacterial pathogen that you can put out, but it's one of those things that you have to put out every year after year in order for it to build up in the soil, just like the grasshoppers are building up.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say that you have a chance, but if you had them last year and you have if your neighbor is a meadow and that's where they're coming from, it's going to be difficult to keep them under control.
Sorry about that, Donna.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other option, if you didn't want to go into chemical like you mentioned, Donna, is turkeys or poultry. Can be a pretty good source of control, but they can also, if they get into your garden space, they can also scratch and tear up your plants and that. So, yeah, not a perfect fit, but
We
great.
have another question that's coming in from Facebook on starting seeds. And it says, instead of lights this year, I'm moving my seed trays outside to full sun on nice days and back in on cold days because we get several nice days between each storm front this time of year in Douglas. My hope is that the plants will mostly sprout in full sun, leading to easier transplanting. I assume they will be slower to grow than inside, but possibly hardier. What are your thoughts on this idea?
That's a lot of commitment.
Yeah. Depends on how many seeds you're starting, how many trays of plants you're going to be moving in and out. If you're home and able to keep after that project, they probably will form a little bit stronger plant. If they're blowing around in the wind a little bit, that does strengthen the stems in the plants, and they probably will have a little bit more of the carbohydrates that form the stronger fibers in the stem in them, so that they have a stronger stem. But if you get distracted and all of a sudden a front comes in and they get left outside in some extreme weather, it can be pretty detrimental to them. And on days where we have a cloudy day and they're not getting much sun indoors, it may cause them to become leggy on those days growth where they're not getting enough light. So it could lead to some weak spots in the stems from the times when they're indoors with low light situation, as opposed to the days where they're outside with intense light from outside. I would be careful if they've been out indoors for several days to put them out in a very bright light, because that's one of the reasons we harden things off before they go outdoors, is you don't want to sunburn them by putting them out for too long the first time they're outdoors, especially those first few true leaves.
So we have a few more questions from Facebook, and sorry for you on Facebook. It took me a little while to go back and forth. One of the questions is it too late to start tomatoes and peppers indoor this year? I live in Cody.
Not at all. I'm not planning to start mine for another week to 10 days so that they don't get too much growth on them before it's time to put them outdoors. One of the things with peppers is they do like a little extra heat. So if you can find a way to put a heat source under them that is safe as far as electricity usage, make sure that it's safe to use with water. But if you can put some heat under the peppers, that will encourage the seeds to germinate a little bit better than just at room temperature. Jeff?
I'm sorry. I was reading another question that we have that's grasshopper related. So go ahead and continue on.
Well, I thought one of you was going to comment. It must have been Jeremiah.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there. Yeah, totally. So they have some of those heat mats, those growing heat mats, and they're rubberized so they can get wet and not have a shortage or anything like that. You don't want to really go out there and get a heating pad, right, like that we'd use for ourselves and use that. But no, that's one way to do it. I wanted to go back to the earlier question of taking the plants outside on nice days and bringing them in. There are people that do that and are very successful with it. A couple of things that I'd add to Donna's comments are get you a dolly or a little cart to help you if you have a lot of plants, to help
A
you
wagon.
wheel those out. A wagon, yeah, something, just so you're not packing those constantly in and out. Just make it easy on yourself as much as you can. If it's just a few flats, that's easy to haul out. But the big point I would like to make is when you move those plants outside, you want to make sure that that temperature is comparable to the room temperature that they're coming from. You don't want them to move from a 65 degree, 70 degree room temperature out to 45 degrees and then that sun to warm up. It just helps with that little bit of a stress or a transition. And as Donna pointed out with the wind, it does help strengthen those little plants. But if you have some high wind gusts like we had here in Powell yesterday, it can be too much on them as well. So it can be detrimental.
Somebody who's watching as well, Kyla, said, I've read that using a fan on low speed in the room where your seedlings are growing or in your greenhouse can help strengthen them. Is this true?
It is true, and it is something that some growers implement in order to keep the stem strength up when they don't get a lot of movement, especially I've seen it with like indoor tomato production. It does keep the stem strength up, and any of those plants like tomatoes that are wind pollinated, it also helps to move some of the pollen around the room when you don't have pollinators in an indoor situation getting that job done.
If you're growing them for years and years and years inside, right?
Yeah, right.
Let me before we go on, I have another question from Kyla. Says she's already saw a grasshopper hopping around in Shoshone last week. And what type of chemical-free grasshopper control options are there? So Wyoming has many species of grasshoppers, and there are some that actually overwinter as adults or late instar nymphs. So it is possible to actually see grasshoppers in Wyoming all year round, which isn't a good thing. But many of those species are not damaging like we think that, like apparently Donna Fox has. So it is possible to see grasshoppers all year round in the state of Wyoming, cold or not. What other chemical-free control options are there? So I've not ever used fowl to control grasshoppers, but I understand that guinea hens are very efficient at controlling grasshoppers. So and maybe a little less destructive in your garden. Jeremiah, do you have any experience with that?
I don't have any experience with guinea hens. We might have to ask Hudson this Friday. Maybe he knows.
He will be on Friday, so we can chat with him about that. So maybe.
One of my ideas, do you know if diatomaceous earth is a good resource to use with grasshoppers? They have a very chitinous exoskeleton, and I don't know whether diatomaceous earth is rough enough for them.
Yeah, so diatomaceous earth in an outdoor setting just doesn't work that well. Diatomaceous earth is mostly used in inside type situations. I don't know, Donna, have you had experience using it outside?
Not on something with that thick of a chitinous exoskeleton. It works really good for slugs and snails, I know.
Okay, so diatomaceous earth it basically in between the insect's joints, it rubs it raw, so they eventually bleed to death. Is how it works in insects and apparently in slugs.
I would imagine it could maybe work, Donna. My only thought is how would you get those grasshoppers in contact with enough of that to make it effective? And especially like Jeff's saying, that fine powder outside in Wyoming is just not usually a good application. It's usually in Nebraska. So
it's in the neighbor's yard. Right. So any other questions, Jenny?
We have several more. They're on insects. So I thought we'd keep them till a little bit later. Donna, was there anything more you wanted to say about seed starting?
Sure. Once you've selected your seeds and you've gotten your containers is probably the next step. There are lots of options. In fact, the other day, Donna Fox showed us containers that she has been making out of old newspapers. So they can be folded out of an old resource and made out of a recyclable or reusable material. Peat pots are another common one. And of course, there are plastic or synthetic containers that can be used for growing your plants indoors. There are specific trays for growing things that larger growers use that have very small openings in them, that you would plant the seeds in a small container and move them up into a larger container, or even in long, narrow rows. And then you would separate the individual plants as you put them into larger containers. So you have lots of options as to what containers you want to put them in. When you're starting them indoors, the last thing you want is for your carpet or your table or whatever, the kitchen counter, wherever they are, to get waterlogged or get damaged from the water that's used in taking care of those plants. So you want to make sure you have a nice, good, solid barrier between the water and whatever counter or surface that it is you're growing it in, so that you don't cause damage to the house. I have seen carpet ruined from mold starting from the plants above. So be careful that you have a good barrier between your surface that you're growing them, but make sure that you have them as close to either a window where they get light, or as we talked about in the title of the program today, using a shop light to grow them with. And then you want to read the labels. There are a few things that like to have light hit the seed. So you'd very scantily cover them with a little tiny layer of the potting mix, as opposed to pushing them down a ½ an inch into the soil. Larger seeds, like beets, which aren't going to get planted indoors. Beans, maybe if you were going to plant them indoors and transplant them outdoors. Larger seeds need to go deeper in the soil, and real fine seeds need to stay real close to the surface, so that once the root germinates, it can reach down into the soil and anchor the plant right away, and that small plant can emerge and start growing up towards the light. But the larger the seed, the deeper it needs to go in the soil. One of the things that you want to look for with your planting is making sure that you're getting low chance of contamination from bacterial or fungal organisms. So if you can get a starter mix or germination mix, usually those are sterilized by the manufacturer, so that you have a low chance of getting something like damping off disease that kills germinating seeds. And you'll be much more successful with your plants and have healthier, stronger plants when it comes time to getting them outdoors. And once you've got them in the pots, you want to make sure that the pot never dries out. So maintaining a high level of moisture in the containers is really important. Whether you're sprinkling water over the surface with something that would spread water, kind of like rainfall, or if you're watering from below so that the pots can soak up the water from below. Try to keep the moisture off of the foliage as your true leaves come onto the plants. And if you've got a light fixture above them, you want to keep it low to start with and then raise it as the plants start. We started a little bit of a conversation about the light fixtures and the quality of the light earlier. There are, as we all know from buying light bulbs for our homes, there's warm light and cool light, and then there's natural light, and there's all kinds of bulbs from incandescents to LED lights, all kinds of different things on the market to use to encourage growth from plants.
Donna, one of the things that are available now are LED grow lights. You don't need a lot of them, and in the visible light, when you look at them, they're either blue or red, and they offer more of the spectrum that plants need in order to keep them from getting leggy.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've mentioned yet, but a lot of it has to do with the distance between the light source and the plants themselves as they grow.
I was just going to ask that. Like you said, you got to keep it close, but how close are we talking? Do we need it right above those plants, a couple inches, 6 inches, and raise it as we go? What?
Yeah, probably just a few inches above the plants. You never want the bulbs to come in contact with the plants themselves. The LED lights are going to stay cool. Some light fixtures, shop lights, can get somewhat warm, And of course, incandescents will get quite warm. So you want to make sure that they stay away from the plants. You wouldn't want to burn the plants from actual coming in contact with the light bulbs. The LEDs that are out there that Jeff mentioned with the blue and the red bulbs have a wavelength that is beneficial for the plants, and it doesn't waste any of the wavelength because it goes directly in and is absorbed by the plants rather than being reflected off. So those can be much closer to the plant, but you just want to keep them above as the plant grows so that they don't come in contact with the plant. I would say a couple of inches to 6 inches as opposed to keeping them a foot or two above the plants. So closer is probably better without direct contact.
The other thing to remember is that a lot of these light fixtures aren't waterproof. So when you're watering, be very careful not to water the light fixture as you're taking care of your plants.
So I've been super impressed about the quality of transplants you can grow just under a plain old shop light in your basement or underneath. I have a friend who puts hers underneath her ping pong table. So you can just hang them on chains, and then you can move them, the chains, if they're on hooks, you can just move the chain lengths up or down to get them closer or farther away. And so those ones, they're really grow better if they're really close. And so I sometimes tell people, you get them so close you're even kind of uncomfortable. So about like an inch away from the plants, they'll get a better quality of light and it'll help them grow. But you can do it now. If you don't want to go to the store right now, you might have a shop light in your garage that you can reuse and use in this manner and grow some really fantastic plants.
So when you put the lights on those, some of those put out quite a bit of heat. So I'm thinking like the fluorescent bulbs. Will they actually dry out that soil medium? Is that something you got to be concerned about, and keeping that moist and damp, especially at the initial stages where those seeds are germinating?
Well, I always keep my eye on them, but so with the fluorescent lights and the shop lights, if you take a regular old shop light and use it for this purpose, the heat's mainly coming from the ballast. So it's not the lights themselves that are necessarily putting out the heat, it's the mechanism above it. And so that can vary depending on what brand you have of shop light. But usually, like if you have in a cool basement, it's just barely enough to kind of warm up the area, and so it kind of helps the plants grow. So it's usually not a big problem.
Usually a positive thing then for you.
Yeah, in my basement it is.
We always need every positive we can get when we're gardening.
Right.
Well, that's the truth.
So if you're using a shop light, you can choose between the warm lights and the cool lights, and that will give you a variation in the light wavelength. And I have seen light fixtures used around like houseplants where you put one cool wavelength and one warm wavelength together, and it gives you something similar to natural lighting. So dependent upon what's available and what light bulbs you can purchase, the fixture you're using, and how many bulbs it will hold, you might consider what wavelength that fixture will have and put out based on the bulbs that you purchase and how many bulbs can go in it. So you have lots of options on buying bulbs to go in those fixtures as opposed to the specific fixtures that are the LED lights that have the blue and the red wavelength specific to those fixtures. So there are lots of options on the market, whether you're shopping at your local hardware store or whether you're shopping in a garden catalog for based on garden supply needs.
So two questions with that. So if I have adequate window space for all my plants, do I need to have lights on them as well? And then on top of that, how long do I keep the lights on? Should I put those on a timer or keep the lights on 24/7?
I guess I don't have experience with lights being on 24/7 except in a research facility. But I would say when you get up, turn the lights on. When you head to bed, turn the lights off. But the more light that gets on them, the more growth you'll have and the stronger photosynthesis will happen. And that energy that develops from photosynthesis will go into more root growth and more leaf growth, which will again encourage more photosynthesis and more energy stored up. So the longer the day for photosynthesis, the better on that. So in some instances, I suppose if you're not concerned about the plants coming in contact with the fixture or them getting too hot, You could potentially leave them on all night long if the light in the house doesn't bother the family during sleeping hours. We don't have a light fixture at home, so we're going to have them close to that southwest facing sliding glass window. And the one thing that we'll have to be careful of when it comes to the plants getting a little bit bigger is turning the container where the pots that are closest to the window get moved to the other side. So we're going to switch the far side to the close side of the window with the plants so that they all get adequate sunlight and they don't start to grow towards the window or towards the light source.
Great.
So for when as those that are here as presenters know, I'm extremely forgetful at times, and so I can't remember to turn the light on and off. And so on my light setup, I have a little timer. You can buy a super simple one at a hardware store and plug it in, and then you plug your lights in there, and then it kicks them on and kicks them off. And so for mine, I just give them 16 hours of light, and that's plenty. They grow fantastic that way, and I just let the timer do the work.
Yeah, and that's
anytime we can automate things, it's better for us all.
Yeah.
The older we get, it's better for us all.
Make it easier on yourself. Anytime you can, make it easier on yourself.
You just want to make sure that you check on that light fixture, and that as the lights are on all the time on their own, that you still keep raising them periodically to keep them above the plants.
We have a couple more questions. One's from Randy. When you're ready to transplant seedlings from the tray into pots, what potting soil mixture would you recommend?
Any kind of a potting mix. I would say it should say potting mix on it. It doesn't have to say growing mix or germination mix or starter mix once you've already got them up and growing. Just because of exposure to the wind and the sun and traffic even in the house, there's going to be some bacteria and fungus in the soil once you've started things. And so you don't have to have that kind of sterile starter to transplant them into, in moving them into a larger container.
That's a good question, yeah. Are there others, Jenny?
There's one more from Kyla. Jenny must have muted herself. If you have raised beds, could you plant out your seedlings any sooner and maybe cover them with old windows or create a type of cold frame? And then would that be only for cold hardy plants? So the answer is yes. You can build yourself a cold frame and germinate things outside in your normal garden space. Is it a little bit, I don't know, I wouldn't think that it's too early to do that. Donna, do you?
I think you could do cold frame growing right now. I'd be hesitant to do tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, and I would probably wait a little bit to do the cucurbits that we talked about earlier as well. So those are warm loving plants, and I would be hesitant knowing that we have a couple of snowstorms this morning. Our regional well-known weatherman said it's probably going to be the next 3 weeks. We're going to have some extremely cold weather with Arctic air hanging out over the center of the country. So I would be real careful about putting out warm season crops right now, but cool season crops, go for it.
So a cold frame will work just pretty much like a high tunnel or a hoop house right now, and in our high tunnel, we have radishes growing. This behind me is spinach, a couple of different varieties of spinach that's been in the ground for 2 weeks. And then the last thing that we have a cole crop, what's been described as a salad mix, not a lettuce mix, because it's not lettuce varieties. And then, believe it or not, last weekend, I planted my sweet corn and my peas. So, but those things are inside of a hoop house, and some of these things in a cold frame would grow just as well. So go for it.
Donna, do you have any suggestions for how big the plants have to be before they're ready to go outside?
I would say you want a couple of sets of true leaves on them, dependent upon what what plant it is that you've got going indoors. Spinach could probably be almost big enough to be harvesting if you've planted it indoors and you're going to transplant it. But as Jeff mentioned, that one, because it's a cold season or cool season or cold crop, can be planted directly outdoors. I would say you don't want it to get to the point where it's blooming, or if it is blooming, you're going to want to remove the blossoms so that the energy of the plant goes into the roots and the leaves. And I guess I would compare most of the plants you're going to transplant out to what you would purchase in a nursery if they were selling it at retail. Many of them have worked out the details and kind of have things timed just right so that they're the right size to put outdoors. The other thing is you have to keep in mind how big they're going to get, because you can't plant 30 foot of seedlings if you don't have 30 foot of space to manage them indoors before you're going to get them outdoors. So you can only plant so much in front of a sliding glass window, or you're going to have to take them out the front door and around the side yard to get to the backyard in order to plant them. So don't lose sight of the fact that the garden is not intended to take over the house indoors.
You mentioned true leaves. What are true leaves?
So when seeds germinate, you're going to have the little cotyledons are going to come off, and that's the energy stores of what's in the seed when it is produced in its mother plant. And that's all the energy the plant is supposed to need in order for it to start growing. Those seed leaves from the cotyledons do not photosynthesize. So the first leaves of the plant, we can probably see some of them behind Jeff, will actually start the germination process. And those are the leaves that look like the spinach, or that look like peas, or they look like cucurbit. They look like a squash leaf. So those are the ones that look like and actually start the photosynthesis process of whatever plant it is that we're trying to grow.
So we got a few more minutes here, Donna. Do you want to talk about hardening off plants as we transition from indoors out?
Yes, we do need to mention hardening off. So that is the process of exposing those tender plants that have been protected from Mother Nature indoors before we send them out to spend the entire growing season out with whatever Mother Nature throws at them for the growing season. So when you decide that it's time to start thinking about the last frost-free day, and it's probably only a few days away before you can transplant them out, you want to put those plants out for a couple of hours into the full sun and the wind and whatever exposure they get in those 2 hours, and then bring them back in and give them a breather from all the exposure that they're going to have. Keep them from getting sunburn. We don't put sunscreen on the plants, but we bring them back indoors before they have been out in the sun for too long. And then the next day you might put them out for 4 hours. The next day, put them out for maybe 6 hours, bringing them indoors after that exposure. After you've had them out for about 8 hours, then you can bring them in one more night, and they should have had enough exposure to the outdoor temperatures that they should survive well by transplanting them out the next day.
Great. Jenny, did you have another question or a comment that I cut you off on? Sorry.
No, we had another one that came in on Facebook, and they said, I read that for every layer of protection you put on a plant, you go south 2 zones. Is that correct? So if I put my plants under a floating row cover in a high tunnel, could I plant warm-loving plants like squash?
You could, but I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah, for every layer of cover you gain a USDA growth zone. But unfortunately, growing in a high tunnel or hoop house, when it gets cold at night, it will be that temperature at night. What you're trying to do with those additional layers is to retain that soil temperature and keep it warm enough for those plants. I'm afraid though that if we have 3 or 4 days in a row like this next storm is predicted to be, where it's going to be cold, and those plants had germinated, they may not make it. You can try it, but you know, it's going to be very iffy.
And that's if you don't have supplemental heat inside that structure.
That's if you don't have supplemental heat. If you do have supplemental heat, go right ahead.
Have fun.
One of the things that you could try if you're going to do that, kind of like I'm planting some things this week and planting some more things next week. If you plant those out and you try it, you still have another couple of weeks that you could still plant stuff indoors and replant out in that high tunnel or low tunnel or under floating row cover. Just remember that Mother Nature may have other plans for things, and every gardener out there will have some plants that don't succeed. I have a former colleague who used to say, if you're not killing plants, you're not trying hard enough. So again, don't beat yourself up if you try something and it doesn't work. You can still try again. And just because it didn't work this year doesn't mean it might not work next year. So as long as you've got seeds to try stuff, gardening, although it's a very enjoyable, peaceful, restful experience, it can also be a scientific experiment, and it's plenty of opportunity if you've got little gardeners to work with to try things and see what happens. And even if something doesn't work out, don't consider it a failure. Just call it a learning experience and try different things the following year as well.
I plan on putting floating row cover over these things that are germinated in my high tunnel during the next storm. So
yeah,
that's just me.
We have a comment and a question. The comment's from Sandra, and I think she might be in Gillette, but I may have gotten that wrong. In my hoop house, I have a low tunnel that has a double layer of plastic on it. I have all my seedlings in there with a red heat lamp on at night, the kind you would use in a chicken coop. My tomatoes survived 1 degree at night.
Great.
And then we have a question.
Supplemental heat.
Right.
Yeah, that's one way
Works
to do it.
wonders.
We have a question from Melanie. What do you recommend is the best method or material for covering plants to protect them from frost if a late frost date occurs?
I really like to use walls of water. The other thing you can do is if you've got empty milk containers or other 1 gallon containers, is fill them with water. They will warm up during the day, so you'd want to do it earlier in the day as opposed to last thing at night unless you put warm water in them. But anything with water in it will hold heat and help to radiate that heat out overnight. Row covers or even sheets of newspaper will help hold that heat down around the ground level to hold the heat in for the plants when they're small. I'm sure the other guys have some ideas as well.
I use floating row cover. I find the material that's the heaviest weight possible that I can, and then I will double it up or triple it up if I need to. I agree with Donna using walls of water, or there's other products out there that are called sailor caps that do the same type of thing, that you fill the sides up with water. A couple of good things to keep that heat in and prevent things from freezing.
Well, that kind of seems to be plant specific, and I'd like you guys' input, but like a tomato plant, right? That's where that wall of water really works really well. But something like behind Jeff's head, that's hard to put a wall of water around, right? And that many. So that's where those row covers come in. And yeah, those low tunnels, low row covers, those, yeah. And you just got to figure out what works best for your situation.
Wall of water works very well on pepper plants too, right? Because you don't have them planted very close together and those types of things.
Along that line, we have a question from Krista. How long should the wall of water stay around a plant? I've read that some people leave them on all summer, and I think I've seen that around Laramie here, but we're a little cold.
Yeah, I actually leave them on our tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants all summer long. We put the tomato cage inside the wall of water after they've gotten up some size, and then they just radiate heat around that plant 24/7 throughout the growing season. And then after harvest, we take the tomato cage out and then dump out the kind of it gets kind of grody. The water inside those well of waters grows some algae and some other things in it, may have some floating insects in it, but we dump those out. And then any that haven't sprung leaks over the summer, we keep for the next growing season. So we reuse those, but use them all summer long.
Great technical term, grody. Like it.
Grody. Yep. Pretty grody.
I think the biggest thing is basically whenever that chance of frost is gone, you can essentially take them off. Do you have to? No. So yeah, just kind of rule of thumb, figure it out for yourself. Great question.
You do have to be careful. Some people use, you can take a milk carton, like a plastic one, cut off the bottom and use it as like a hot cap. So you put it on top of the plant and it acts like a mini greenhouse. The only thing you have to be really careful about is they warm up super fast, like a greenhouse would. So you have to be careful to either remove them or take the top off or something, let the heat out. Otherwise you can actually cook your poor little plant. Because even though we're kind of cold in many parts of Wyoming, we have super solar resources, so stuff heats up fast.
Yeah, you wouldn't want that plant reaching for the sunlight, growing out the top of the milk plant or the milk carton, and then having to thread it off of the plant without doing any damage either.
Right, yeah. Great, well, I think we're about done unless there's any more questions.
Well, another person has their hand raised. I don't know if we can answer that question or not.
And there is another question from Sandra. Donna, have you put walls of water around cabbage so you could put them out earlier, maybe in April?
I have not used walls of water on cole crops, but because they are so cold hardy, I don't know that you'd need to, especially if you have some way to put a row cover or I've even used old sheets and blankets if you don't have the garden resource of the row cover to protect things in a snowstorm. And because they can handle the cold, I wouldn't hesitate to put them out in the garden to benefit from the warm days that we're having now. However, at this point, because we have potential for 3 weeks of impending cold weather, I'll probably just keep them indoors for now and put them outdoors, and then we'll be those 3 weeks ahead on the growth when the 3 weeks of snowstorms are over.
One of the main benefits of walls of water or sailor cap product is that they don't blow away easily in Wyoming.
Yeah.
Floating row cover is called floating row cover for a reason.
Yeah, but you can use landscape hooks or spikes to hold it down and then pull it up and roll it up.
You can anchor it down, but you have to anchor it down really well.
Yeah.
Make sure it's anchored all the time.
Yes, all 4 sides.
Yes. So we had one more question before we wrap up.
There's a hand raised. I don't know if you can see that, Jenny, or not.
Yes, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. There's a couple of folks that have questions on Facebook that have to do with disease problems and insects. And so we'll try to get those answered to you on Facebook. So we'll try to type you some answers before we end.
So do you want us to wrap up since we're over time?
I think we will. It's been awesome, and your questions have been fantastic.
Yeah, wow, this has been a great session. We kind of keep getting a little better at this, so hopefully we'll get a perfect one of these days. But thank you, Donna, so much for joining us and having this conversation with us. For any of you out there that have questions for us, hit us on Facebook. Like Jenny said, we'll answer those questions best we can. If you want to know more, right? So we talked about that reference chart on the last frost-free day for your specific area. That's on the Barnyards Backyards website. That's on the left-hand side. There is the URL code. Also on that Barnyards and Backyards website, we're going to have we have a list of these Zoom meetings, when they are. We're right now Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. So if you want to see what the next sessions are, the next topics, look there as well. We are recording this one. We didn't the last one. And so this recorded, once it's complete, we will will finish this recording and post it back up on that website. So if you have friends or family, or if you want to watch this again, it's up there. You'll be able to watch that anytime. We'll also try and share that out through Facebook. The other thing is, if you want to get in touch with us, get a hold of your extension office, your county offices. There is an office, and sometimes more than one, in every county of the state, and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. So to find that, that is on the right-hand side of the screen here, and that URL code. So please give us a call, shoot us an email, whatever. We are more than willing to help you, glad to help you out with your individual situations. Also, when we finish out, there's an evaluation on the internet browser. You'll probably be prompted. We'd appreciate you filling out that evaluation. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know your perspective on this. This is a new trial run for us, and we're real excited to do it, but we need your feedback to make it better. So with that, you guys have a good Wednesday, and we will see you on Friday at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Bye-bye.